Hi all, welcome back to Introduction to American Politics. Again, I hope that you are enjoying your first module, finding it a nice distraction in this time of social distancing. My older son just woke up upstairs, so we may hear crashing of Legos and whatever else is going on, Star Wars battles, but hopefully this lecture will go fine. So today we're going to continue our discussion of the origins of the Constitution by talking about the debate that unfolds once the Great Compromise is achieved and the Constitution is sent for ratification among the 13 colonies. And so we'll talk about the debate between the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, about the nature of this new, stronger national government that we're going to create, and again, how this debate helps us understand both the logic of the separation of powers, why our government is organized as it is, and also why we do end up including, as the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, some specific protections both for individual freedoms, liberties, civil rights, and also for the rights of the states. So it's going to be an interesting discussion. Before I get started, what I want to do is briefly revisit what I refer to as the founding paradox, which of course Professor Goggin was talking about in the last video. And to me, the founding paradox is very interesting because it helps us understand the way that the founders who are proposing a stronger new constitution were trying to thread the constitutional needle. And so in my view, the founding paradox unfolds because the hard lessons of the Articles of Confederation lead to the Constitutional Convention and the Great Compromise, where they recognize that they want to or need to create a stronger national government. The lessons of the American Revolution and the failure of the Articles of Confederation was that in order to coordinate among the many states, in order to produce the collective goods of national defense, of superior trade, more stable revenue system, they needed to create a stronger national government. And yet, they also need to limit the power of this more stronger national government. The founders are coming out of the Revolutionary War, right? They are embarking on a project to allow men to govern themselves through a form of representative democracy. The last thing they want to do when creating this stronger national government is to create a tyrannical government. And in fact, they're going to try to prevent tyranny in all forms. So they want to first and foremost prevent the emergence of a monarchy or an aristocracy, a government of the few that dominates the interests of the many. They want this in two ways. They want to preserve their individual freedom as people, but they also want to make sure that they retain some autonomy as states. The second thing they want to prevent is mob rule, a tyranny of the majority. They are worried about the masses. The experience of Shays' rebellion has taught them that there are going to be threats, especially short-term threats, as the public demands change from their government, and they worry that mob rule will lead to instability and a failure of government. So the question is, how are they going to do both? How are they going to prevent a tyranny of the minority, prevent monarchy while they create this stronger government, and how are they going to prevent a tyranny of the majority, a tyranny of mob rule? What they do is they embed these solutions in constitutional design. And the debate, as we'll see, between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists is going to be largely a debate about views on whether this is likely to work. The Federalists are more organized and more certain that this new constitution, through the separation of powers, will be effective in producing a stronger national government, but also one that's not tyrannical. To review some of these solutions that they intend to use to prevent both tyranny of the majority and tyranny of the minority in this new constitution, we can review some of these provisions. So the first is they institute the provision of federalism. This is the shared power between autonomous state governments and the new national government. And as we'll see in a few slides, this is going to be a fairly interesting perspective and debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, because the Anti-Federalists are very worried about a strong national government, about people losing touch with the government that makes decisions about their lives. The Anti-Federalists want a more intimate, homogenous, smaller government. They prefer local governments, and they're worried about a large and diffuse national government. But Madison has a very interesting argument about how this diffuse, large national government will actually be a solution to the threat of tyranny rather than the cause of tyranny. And this is what I refer to as Madison's size principle. In essence, through the principle of federalism, Madison is going to argue that a large and diverse government is going to prevent any majority from dominating national politics. And I think it's useful to put this into context of modern American democracy, where we have 50 states that are sharing power. They are autonomous states: California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, you get it, right? But then in Washington, D.C., they share power through representation, both in the Senate and the House of Representatives, and in the selection of the president. So how is it that this size principle works? Well, what Madison's going to argue is that by virtue of being geographically diffuse, preferences are going to be distributed differently all throughout the country. Preferences in the American South will be different from those in the Northeast. People in the Northeast will have a different take on government than those in the Midwest. People in the Midwest will differ from those in the Mountain West, the Pacific Northwest, the Southwest, or in California. So all of these people have different visions of life. They have different ideologies, different preferences, but they have to make common cause in Congress. And this is going to prevent any single group from dominating politics, because it's going to be difficult to stitch together a single coalition that is an umbrella that can dominate national politics. In order for things to work, you have to get liberal voters from coastal California to make a common cause with more conservative voters from the state of Utah. So the very breadth and geographic distribution of federalism is going to prevent the concentration of power. It's going to make it hard to unify the branches and hard for a tyranny of either the majority or minority to emerge. The second thing that the founders do in their wisdom, and Professor Goggin covers this in the last lecture video, is the separation of powers within this new federal government. They're going to divide power across the branches, divide it between the presidency, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary. And they're going to make it hard for any single group, again, to dominate politics, to dominate power through their institution. In order to get decisions made, you have to have cooperation across the branches. The president is required to sign those laws that both the House of Representatives and the Senate agree to. More importantly, we can see that the way they stagger the selection and tenure of the representatives is meant to balance these pressures for a tyranny, for a majority rule and a minority rule. So we have a Senate, which is supposed to be insulated from popular pressure. They serve 6-year terms, and only 1/3 of the Senate is selected every 2 years. Whereas in the House of Representatives, they are all selected every 2 years. So one chamber is meant to be responsive to the popular will, and the other, the Senate, is meant to be removed from it. In fact, during the time of the founding, the Senate is selected indirectly. They're chosen by state legislatures rather than through a direct vote of the people. So we can see that they are trying to balance the tyranny of the majority and the tyranny of the minority by offsetting them against each other, rather than one of the brilliant features of the founders is their decision not to ignore that men have ambitions, that people pursue political power, but rather reading contemporary European political theory to recognize that people have power. This is an empirical reality. This is a truth, and design a government where you can use people's pursuit of power and ambition to prevent the concentration of power and ambition by creating mechanisms where people have to compete with and offset each other's powers against each other through the separation of powers. The final thing that's going to emerge in this debate over the new article constitution is whether or not there should be specific guarantees of individual and state rights included in a constitution. This is going to be through our individual Bill of Rights, which will become the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And this specifically comes from some anti-federalists who want to ensure that people, individuals now consenting to this new government, if they ratify the Constitution, will be specifically protected from the arbitrary power of this new government. They want guarantees that government will not be able to deprive them of individual freedoms and liberties like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, that the power of the state won't be used arbitrarily and coercively, that there'll be rules and procedures and liberties that are guaranteed to citizens of the United States. In order to ratify the Constitution, they have to send the Constitution to the states, and 9 of the 13 states must approve this new Constitution. We can already see here that some of the lessons of the failures of the Articles of Confederation have been learned. They've come out of the Constitutional Convention in that they no longer require unanimous consent to adopt this new Constitution. Instead, it's a supermajority. So 9 of the 13 states have to approve the Constitution for it to go into effect. There are going to be clear winners and losers here. Many small states are going to be okay with these articles, the new Constitution, largely because through the Senate, they're going to retain equal political power in the Senate in making decisions over national affairs. Some states like New York are going to be hesitant to adopt these the Constitution, in part because they worry that they're going to be losers in this Constitution. They're going to lose political power. Maybe they'll lose some of their economic advantage. The Constitution is sent to the states for ratification in 1787, and through a national campaign that's going to play out differently in each of the 13 states, there's going to be a debate that erupts between what we now refer to as the Federalists, those who probably should have been called nationalists. They favor a stronger, new national government, and the anti-Federalists, a less organized group, but stitched together of those who are, for various reasons, reluctant to cede state autonomy, state power to a strong new national government, people who favor a weaker national government, and probably imagined, although there's no clear agreement between them, they probably imagined a weaker national government that was a more incremental change from the Articles of Confederation. So the debate's going to erupt. And in general, it will erupt over the extent of power that should be given to both this new national government and retained to each of the states. Debates over the logic of representation. How should those who now will represent people and states within this new National Government Act, how they should aspire to make decisions on behalf of people and states? They're going to debate where the threats to tyranny are. Again, this idea that is it going to be a threat of the new monarch, threat of the elite, or is it going to be a threat of mob rule? In general, as we'll see, the Federalists are comfortable with elite rule and more worried about a rule of the masses. And the anti-Federalists are hesitant. They are middle class, lower income, largely agricultural, and they worry about the elites and they want to retain intimate, homogeneous government as close to the people. And then they're going to debate whether this new national government is going to pose a serious threat to individual and collective freedom. Well, so the first thing we'll talk about is who they are. So the Federalists and Anti-Federalists typically differ in background and philosophy. These are broad categories. Remember, the campaign differs in each of the 13 states that are asked to ratify the Constitution. But in general, the Federalists are those who stand to win with the creation of a stronger national government. They're property owners, creditors, merchants. The reason they want a stronger national government is they think that with stronger trade, stronger national currency, guarantees of national security, they're going to thrive. And the economy is going to flourish. They'll be beneficiaries of this new government. They're nationalists. They want a strong national government. They favor the proposal to prevent the concentration of power in anyone's hands through a separation of power. But they especially fear a tyranny of the minority, what they call excess democracy. The Federalists are organized. They write famously the Federalist Papers arguing for the ratification of this new constitution. Men like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, the authors of the Federalist Papers, and also George Washington stand out as prominent people advocating for ratification of this new constitution. The Anti-Federalists are a less organized, more diffuse group, but they take on the name largely in opposition to those who are calling themselves Federalists, and are a broader population, less likely to be of the elite. They're small farmers, people who are in debt, shopkeepers. They worry that they stand to lose with the creation of a large national government, either because this new national government is going to impose tariffs that make it harder for them to sell their agricultural commodities overseas, or that their terms of their debts are going to be less favorable, and mostly that they're going to lose intimate local government. They're worried that they're going to have to cede power to elites who are far away, rather than live under the rule of a local homogeneous government that reflects their true preferences and values. One of the contributions they're going to make is through these demands to make sure that individual liberties are not violated. They are eventually going to start advocating for the inclusion of a Bill of Rights, although the inclusion of the Bill of Rights is actually voted down during the Constitutional Convention, and the sincerity of whether or not they truly want a Bill of Rights or using the proposal in the convention is unclear. Some truly wanted it, some just thought it would help scuttle the adoption of the Constitution, but it's going to gain traction a little bit later, and we'll cover it a little bit today and much more when we talk about civil liberties. The Federalists and Anti-Federalists are going to debate a number of features. We'll focus on, I think, 3 right here. The first is what type of representation should those who are elected or appointed to represent people and the states in Congress undertake? Federalists, recall, are much more comfortable with elite rule. They're much more comfortable that government requires levels of education, perhaps wealth. Some of these opinions are retrograde, some of them remain current. But they support something we refer to now as trustee representation. And we can think of this as they view the job of a congressperson, be it a senator, a member of the House of Representatives, to be entrusted to make good decisions on behalf of their citizens. That doesn't mean they do exactly what the citizens they represent want. Instead, they use their wisdom, they use their judgment, they use their education, their faculties to make determinations on what's best for their people. So it's a little bit insulated from the direct wishes of the people. Politicians are going to use their discretion. They're going to focus on issues of policy and national welfare and be less responsive to popular pressure. The idea is that these politicians will be removed from the people, that they may have virtues that make them able to see problems and resist popular pressure and make long-term decisions that are for the good of the country and for good policy. These people will represent large, diffuse districts, and they want to stagger elections to make it hard for there to be unification of the branches. So remember, one of the logics of having staggered election is that if in 1 year, say right now, people are really, really worried about something and they're really angry at government or really, really want new policy to be adopted, they may call for it. And they say, oh, let's throw the bums out and vote in a bunch of people who will do exactly what we want, give us all a huge tax cut and pay us a bunch of money. The problem is if we're always making decisions with sort of short-term incentives, the long-term stability of government will suffer. At least this is what the Federalists are going to argue, which is why they favor staggering the elections so that popular pressure can't cycle out all of those representatives in government in one single election. The Anti-Federalists are much less comfortable with entrusting elites to make decisions on their behalf. They favor what we refer to as delegate representation. They want the elected official who serves them in Congress to make the decisions that they instruct them to make. We delegate to you the responsibility to do what we want. And in fact, this distinction between trustee and delegate representation remains current today. I once heard a Tea Party congressman talked about how he really embraced this vision of delegate representation, that his job wasn't necessarily to reflect with and disagree with the preferences of his constituents, but instead be a vehicle by which his constituents' preferences were directly brought to his vote and into the halls of Congress. These delegates support pure democracy, local democracy, that is a true picture of the people. They have a vision where the best way to make decisions is through small, more intimate, homogeneous governments where people are alike within a given region. So smaller geographic districts, smaller electoral districts, which reflect the true wishes of people within that community. And almost by definition here, they are going to be fearful of the arbitrary power of a stronger national government because they're worried about diffuse government. They also worry a lot about different threats of tyranny. Now, we've talked about this, and we need not dwell on it for too long, but the Federalists really do worry about a fear of the majority, a fear of the masses, or mob rule. Federalists, in their arguments and in the Federalist Papers, when they spell it out, are very, very worried about mobs making decisions that are unwise. They want to make sure they can preserve property rights, preserve market economy, trade, and they favor the separation of powers partially to insulate government from the mobs. So, there's a slight elite bias in the Federalists, and they favor the separation of powers to insulate government from mass rule. The anti-Federalists are just suspicious of all branches of government. They're about to adopt a stronger national government, either in Congress or the presidency, especially the presidency. And what they really don't want is to be dominated again. And remember, they're coming out of the experience of the revolution against a monarch. They do not want to again be subjects to a tyrant, subjects to a rule of the few. They want responsive legislatures that are directly accountable. And they worry that the separation of powers with staggered election is going to make popular democracy difficult. It's going to make it harder for government to reflect the wishes of the people, and they worry that the separation of powers is going to be a tool of the elite. As you can imagine, this leads to very different ideas about the power these governments should have. The Federalists are in favor of a strong, active federal government that can draw from the lessons of the Articles of Confederation and resolve the problems that the Articles of Confederation were unable to do. So this governmental power for the Federalists, they want a government that can coordinate and solve persistent problems of collective action. They want this government to be able to negotiate trade for these new United States of America with European powers. They want this new government to be able to negotiate and provide for national defense of the United States. They want it to have a stronger currency, a unified currency, and they, again, favor checks and balances to prevent mob rule and maintain this strong power. The anti-Federalists want a weaker, limited central government. And in fact, they're very suspicious of this strong federal government. They're worried that the federal government will not be able to provide for the general welfare through civic virtue. In fact, what they think is that civic virtue requires a connection between people and a local government where the local government understands the needs and values of people in this community. And they worry that if we transfer power to a farther away and more diffuse national government, people will no longer really have an incentive to submit to the laws of this new national government because they'll be distrustful of it, or they won't maintain that intimate connection with it. It won't be as current to their lives. A final debate erupts over the inclusion of the individual rights in the Bill of Rights and the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. We will unpack this a little bit later when we talk about civil liberties and civil rights in week 3 of this class, module 3 of this class. But there's an interesting debate that emerges right now, and I think it's really instructive, between how some of the prominent thinkers in the Federalist group, Federalist campaign, think about these demands for a Bill of Rights. So the anti-Federalists argue to some extent that we need a Bill of Rights. They have to ensure individual freedoms from the power of this new government. They're very worried that with the ratification of the Constitution, both states and individual people are going to have their rights infringed upon by this new national government. Now, what I find interesting is the response of the Federalists. They don't dismiss this idea, but they think that a Bill of Rights is going to be in some ways superfluous, even problematic. What they argue is that once you start to identify express rights that belong to the people or to the states, it may imply that what's not specifically enumerated in these Bill of Rights belongs to the federal government. And they think that's wrong. They think, no, only the powers we've listed in the Constitution belong to this new federal government. It is implied that people retain these freedoms, that states retain these freedoms and independence, that we don't want to start listing out specific freedoms people do have, specific freedoms states do have, because once you start to list them out, it implies that there are rights and freedoms they don't. Nonetheless, they're going to resolve this in part by adding provisions to the Bill of Rights that simply leave those rights and freedoms that are not specifically listed to the people in the states. It's going to be a way that they eventually thread the needle. As this debate unfolds, the goal is to get to 9 states. The Federalist Papers are written to target some of the larger states that they worry are reluctant to adopt the Constitution, to ratify the Constitution, specifically New York. But nonetheless, as ratification unfolds, you can see that when New Hampshire adopts or chooses to ratify the Constitution, it becomes the law of the land. I think it's significant that the ratification campaign succeeds in getting these other remaining states to also ratify the Constitution, because it signals that there's buy-in ultimately to this new Constitution that's going to govern the states. To summarize this discussion's where we're going to leave it today, let's just say that the summary of the anti-Federalist Federalist debates is that there's a compromise. The Federalists succeed in getting the states to ratify this non-constitution, but that it comes with a compromise over the Bill of Rights, and they promise to initiate a campaign to ratify a Bill of Rights following the adoption of the new constitution. With the exception of being pressured into including a Bill of Rights, which is from preferences of the anti-Federalists, the Federalist vision of government endures. The Great Compromise, the provisions of the separation of powers, a stronger national branch with a single president, with a bicameral legislature, with a new judiciary, right? This is going to be the vision of government that becomes ratified in the Constitution of America and which continues today. One of the interesting things we'll talk about in the weeks to come is first the wisdom of this new constitution, right? But also some of the problems, right? Does the separation of powers make government too sluggish? Does it make government unable to pass meaningful policy agendas that meet the needs of the people? Is the Electoral College anti-democratic? Is it problematic that the way we select the president can often produce situations where a president is chosen not by the majority of the American people, but actually by a minority? So there's going to be some really fun debates we can have moving forward about whether this constitution we adopted has been successful. It's hard to argue it hasn't, right? It's created reasonable stability for much of our country's history, but whether there are also cracks in the Constitution, whether there are places where we may need to think about modernizing it. These are just theoretical debates that we'll have moving forward. I hope you're staying safe. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're moving through your modules and getting ready to post your first discussion response. And I look forward to hearing from you and learning about who you are in the Welcome Forum. So, goodbye.